Right, hello, welcome back, and today we are putting a Hobbywing 1080 ESC in a friend of mine's TRX4 Defender. He already has one in there, but it's playing up, and so they sent him a new one through warranty, and I'm just looking for the knife that I need to get into it. Let's have a look. There we go. I've got marginally more organised these days, so we'll see how it goes. I'm also attempting to try and do some time-lapse recording of this. I did it for a previous video and it just didn't work because I'm stupid and pressed record but then accidentally pressed stop and then just recorded the video without checking. So I'll just check. Yeah, that's definitely working. So we might get some different angles for this one rather than just me being a talking head. Right, the 1080. It's my preferred brushed ESC. The Charisma Arc 2 is pretty good, but I don't like the LiPo cutoff on it. Plus, comes with a programming card, it comes with some heat shrink for soldering on your connectors, and this is going to be a bit of a, like, how to solder an ESC up. I know that Jim, my friend with the Defender, runs the Traxxas Lite kit, so what I'm going to do is put a JST onto these, onto the plug, because we're going to be replacing the plug with the Deans, which I'm looking around quickly for because I've forgotten to get out of the box, but we'll find one of those in a minute. First of all, let's cut ourselves a reasonable sized wire for the lights. Can just kind of estimate this because I can always trim it down if it's a bit too long. All I'm going to do with this wire is solder one end to the battery connector, and then I'll pop the JST on once I've checked the sizing. So I'll trim the end that cut a bit cleaner than the other. And yeah, I don't know how much experience people in the hobby have soldering. If you have lots of experience, then please don't tell everyone how bad my soldering is. And if you don't have lots of experience, then there's a few little tips in here that hopefully will help. So yeah, so with the Deans, and I always forget this, I don't know why, it's probably just nerves on camera, the batteries have a female plug and you want a male plug on your truck. So I've just trimmed a bit of wire, probably just need a little bit longer. That's great, and I've got some heat shrink. Well, in fact I use the Hobbywing heat shrink. It's nice that they give you that, although they probably expect you to use it on the motor rather than on the battery cable that you've just chopped off. I'm going to slide the heat shrink over and get it right to one end, so if the wire heats up it doesn't shrink prematurely. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the two negative wires, one for the JST and one for the battery connector. I'm going to sort of fan them out and kind of twist them back together to form one cohesive clump. And what we'll do is we'll tin both of these wires so that I don't knock them around and make a mess. So hopefully the time lapse will capture that, and I'll hold it up to this camera just in case I forget. But you sort of fan them out, push the JST wire into the middle and then wrap it all up and just give it a good twist. Now I've got my helping hand octopus doodad thing here, so what I'm going to do is just grab that wire and try and clamp both of them. I'm going to get my knife and just take a little bit of flux and pop it on the top. I can turn the heat up on my soldering iron a little bit, it's just idling there. So to start with the soldering iron, I'm just going to dip it in the flux, quickly dab it in my brass wire. I use brass wire rather than a sponge. Put plenty of solder on the tip and then dab that off. So now the tip has a really thin coat of solder, and that will stop it from reacting with the air, but we don't want a lot of solder on the tip. Now I'm going to put my solder just on top of the wire, so when the tip touches it, there's a little bit of solder between the wire and the tip. And then I'm just going to feed the solder on the top of the wire while the tip is underneath the wire, and the heat should be transferring through, and I can see from the flux bubbling away there that that's happening, and then I can just melt the solder against the wire, not against the tip, while the tip is filling everything up with heat, because it's all about heat transfer. Now, you don't need to go mad with the solder. You don't need a big blob on there. You just need to see that your wires are coated so that they hold together. Because solder isn't a material that you want to use for electronics. It's or transmitting current. It's just there to hold things together. Right. Let me just repeat the process with the other one, which has already fallen apart because I wasn't quick enough. So I'll just unwind those, fan them together, and repeat the process. Now with the flux, you don't need to go mad with the flux, but all wire has a bit of a coating on it. So what the flux does is it's a bit of a corrosive agent that's generally heat activated if you get the right flux. Heat it up while you're soldering, and that will burn off any coating on the wire, which allows the solder to stick a lot better. Right, I've got a nice curled together wire. Now this is how I join together wires when they're side by side. When they're the other way, what I tend to do is get the two tips, put them across, and then like twist them round that way. And that just gives you less surface area between the joining connections. Don't try and get the threads and join them together and then solder them, because then they can pull apart. The twisting together gives you a little bit of grip as well. Now that's far too much solder. The amount of solder you need, flux that you need varies, but I would say just enough to get a coating and then just remove any excess. It just allows the heat to get through. Yeah, that looks good. Right, that's all sorted. And because the heat shrink was right at the bottom, the heat shrink hasn't melted. That's not sort of even got warm. In fact, these cables are barely warm to the touch because we've managed to get all of that melted in really quickly. If you're doing soldering on really big cables, either use a thicker gauge solder like this, or get your solder, fold it in half and twist it up, and then as you solder you get twice as much solder, which actually is what I'm going to do for the plugs. So the plugs require a lot of solder very quickly. Now I should be using a bigger soldering iron tip, but I'm just going to run it at about 350, 375 just to get it onto the Deans adapter. So yeah, you end up with like this twisted cable. Right, so we want to solder a Deans connector on. These are notoriously annoying, so my tips for them is don't try and put them in one of these and they wobble about. Is grab something that can clamp the connector, and then I'm going to have one holding on to the prongs, and then I need to remember which one's positive and negative, which I always forget. Positive is that way. So I'm going to heat up this solder with my clips on and basically push against the connector and try and get it to just melt off that existing solder. In fact, we can probably reuse that existing solder. So that's nice and hot now. So I'm going to get some residual heat in there. Yeah, we'll hold it this way, that'll make sense. Right, so now it's a case of heating up the soldering that we've just done, where we've tinned it, and then press it all together. Now that's often easier said than done, so I'm just going to try and concentrate and hopefully get it. Then essentially, while burning your fingers and regretting that you've done this, push the piece that you've tinned on to the plug, and that should push the wire against it, and then just try and tidy up any gloopiness or gloops of solder by just rubbing the iron against it and straightening it up, because that'll make getting the heat shrink on easier. And then we end up with a connector, and then we just do the same on the other one, and then we'll go on to the motor bullets. Yeah, that's a good connection. Right, so let that cool, and once it's cooled, we'll just give it a bit of a pull, just make sure it's tight. It doesn't have to be like you can yank it apart, but with Dean's connectors people often pull on the wires, so you just want to check that that's not a problem. I'm also just going to grab some tweezers and just straighten up one of the connectors, because with a Dean's you've got a flat blade and then you've got a thin piece of spring to hold the battery on, and sometimes they can shift and you just move them back because it just means that the plug's melted slightly, but it goes back fine. Right, they are now, yep, they're pretty solid. I haven't got a heat gun, it's over there somewhere, so I'll use that in a minute to sort that out. We're going to do the bullet connectors, and that's probably why I've got the twisted wire. Now, Jim has decided that he wants fancy bullet connectors on this, so what we're going to do is make sure that these all metal bullet connectors are sleeved properly, so when he puts them together and the truck wobbles about and they crack against each other, that we don't set his truck on fire, because I think he would be rather upset at me if that happened. Just put some heat shrink on the wires and yet again push the heat shrink right to the end. What I've done with the bullet connector is fill it full of solder, and then I'm going to just push, well, I'm just going to top up the solder on the tip of the cable, just to get that a bit warm and melty and get that cable nice and melted. In fact, that needs a bit of flux because it's not taking the solder. There we go, that works great. Now with the bullet connectors, they've got like a little recess, so I'm just going to heat up the solder in the bullet connector again. You can see from all the smoke I've got stuff on the soldering iron. Now these are brass, so you can just get these really nice and hot, and then you just dunk your wire in. And then all the solder that's blobbed on your wire should melt, and the wire should just make its way into the bullet connector. Or if you're doing this in your garage in winter and you've had to turn the heater off because it's making too much noise, then you might need a few attempts. Right, that's far too hot to touch. I will work on the other one and then come back to that one once it's cooled down. This one I'm going to do slightly differently, because I'd forgotten about the holes in the side of the bullet connectors, because the last time I used these I bought cheap nasty ones, and it looks like Jim has bought decent ones. And then yeah, they've got a little hole in them that you put your soldering iron in, and that melts the solder from the bottom, and then hopefully I should be able to push this cable in. There we go, and as that solder melts, the wire sinks in, then everything gets really, really, really hot, and then you know that as the heat starts to transfer to the wire, that it's made its way in and it's making a good contact with the brass that you've just made super hot and burnt your fingers while recording a video. Right, great, that's all soldered up. A little bit's leaked out of the port to do it up with, so I'm just going to just get that flattened down and moved out the way. Oh, the smell of burning silicon cables, wonderful. Right, so we should be able to shroud those, and actually it turns out what I was going to shroud it with isn't big enough to make it over the plugs, so I'm going to chop that off and try again. I'll try a slightly larger gauge. So I want heat shrink big enough to go right to the end of the bullet connectors. So I've just got my big box of heat shrink next to me. That's great. That's going to shrink up perfect. The other bullet connectors are going to go on the truck, so I'm going to clear down, get the truck and sort that out.